think tonight's lecture is one of the most important in the entire series. It sets the tone for the eventual destiny of Rome in terms of its character and its historical destiny. And the character and destiny of Rome has been the character and destiny of the Western world ever since. So that in a nutshell, the events of the Second Punic War, some 2,200 years ago, have set an archetypal pattern which we've been following ever since. And in many ways, the Second Punic War was refought again in our time in the form of the Second World War. And many of the conditions that obtained in the spiritual perception of the Roman people have reoccurred in our own time, in our generation. We would like to, I suppose, at all times, just refer to the grand literary achievements of man, or to the religious achievements of man. But there are times when on the historical stage and in the personages of dramatic figures, usually in a military garb, that the spiritual funneling comes into sharp relief and focus upon the actual stage of contemporary events. We have that condition in the subject tonight, and it won't take any of you very long in reflection to see that it applies to our generation in our own time equally as well. I'm not the first to observe this, and in fact, it has bothered a lot of classical historians to the extent that one of the greatest, Arnold Toynbee, A.J. Toynbee, who wrote a massive study of history, in 1965 wrote two huge volumes called Hannibal's Legacy, The Hannibalic War's Effects on Roman Life, published in 1965. And in conversations with Toynbee in San Francisco about 1966, 67, just after this came out, he reiterated personally, he has great concern that somehow an archetypal pattern had been tapped again in our own time, and the thread on the spool was playing itself out much like it had in Roman history at that time. So many of the observations that are to be applied to the Second Punic War apply in a similar fashion to the Second World War. I think in terms of the cultural contrast that I should begin tonight, as far from Rome as possible, just to let you intuit and see for yourselves the enormous cultural contrasting between the Hellenistic world of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Roman agrarian military world of the Western Mediterranean, which were there side by side contemporaneously. I brought a translation of an Alexandrian poet, Hellenistic Greek poet of the 3rd century BC, Theocritus, the Idyls of Theocritus, who set the fashion for a poetic form which he invented, known as the pastoral. And in the 15th idyl, he has a poetic conversation between two women in Ptolemaic Alexandria, about the beginning of the reign of Philadelphus, and it runs something like this. There are two women, Gorgo and Praxinoa. Is Praxinoa at home? Gorgo, of course I'm home, darling. How long it's been. It's a wonder you got here at all. Eunoia got a chair and put a cushion on it. It will do just as it is. Well, sit down then. Well, I'm a helpless thing, Praxinoa. I barely got here alive through all the crowds and chariots, big boots and men in soldiers' cloaks all over the place, and the road going on forever. You really live too far out. It's that crazy husband of mine. He comes out here to the ends of the earth and buys a shed, not a house, just so we won't be neighbors. Out of sheer spite, the brute. He's always the same. Darling, don't talk about your man Dinan like that when the little one's around. See, woman, how he's staring at you? There, Zophrion, honey, she doesn't mean daddy. Heavens, the child understands. Nice daddy. All the same, that daddy the other day, it was just the other day, I told him, Dad, go get some soda and rouge at the street stall, and he came back with salt, the big lummox. Mine's the same. Money is nothing to Diocletes. Just yesterday, for 7 drachmas, he bought dog's hair, pluckings of old wallets, 5 fleeces, he called them, nothing but trash, and work on top of work. But come on, get your dress and cloak. Let's go and see the Adonis exhibit at the king's palace. Wealthy Ptolemaeus, I hear that the queen has got up a fine show. Everything's fine in fine houses. What you've seen you can talk about when you've seen it and others haven't. It's time to go. Well, every day is a day off for people with nothing to do. Eunoia, you slovenly, pick up the spinning. And hurry. Well, let's go. How's this look? And off they go to see Ptolemy's exhibit arranged by his wife in the palace, and there are long lines. At the same time as this sophisticated worldliness was obtaining in Alexandria, the farmer communities of central Italy had been battering at each other, literally with clubs and shields, for so long that they had supposed that this was an honest way of life. And like the old Connecticut Yankees of 100, 150 years ago, they rather suspected anyone who would look up from their lot in life and try to look over the horizon of what day-to-day hard life would bring. And by the time of the Second Punic War, which began in 218 BC, we have the incredible contrast of an individual of extraordinary personality and genius arising in the upper classes of Rome, who was given this extraordinary Hellenistic Greek vision and a capacity for mysticism which would have been at home in Alexandria. And yet he rose out of these Roman pedestrian horizons and found himself all of his life constantly trying to be hemmed in by these conservative, old agrarian reforms. And we will see in the story as it develops that the person in whom this conservative, almost a reactionary fear and mistrust of someone like Scipio Africanus was encased was M. Porcius Cato. And in Plutarch's Life of Cato, in the first chapter, he makes a great deal out of Cato having been brought up in very common, ordinary, old Roman ways, having in fact worked with his hands on the ground of the family farm. Plutarch, of course, makes a little slip in proportion when he says that Cato worked alongside the family slaves on the land, which shows that they were indeed fairly large landowners. And in fact, the family farms were just part of the properties of M. Porcius Cato's family. But it was a fact that he did not come from a noble family. And I think here it's well to note that in the period of time that we're talking about, only about 20 families ran Rome. Almost 2/3 to 3/4 of all the consuls, the praetors, the quaestors came from about 20 Roman families. The most distinguished of those families at this time, of course, were the Scipios, and especially the gens of the Cornelii. And it was an extraordinary event to have someone outside of this charmed circle of patrician families enter into the political picture, and especially in a dramatic way in which Cato finally emerged victorious. It was so extraordinary that the Roman term for such an individual was a novus humanus, a new man, in contrast to nobilitas, somebody from the nobility. Scipio, on the other hand, if you recall from last week's lecture, had an ancestor who was there for the sack of Rome in 387, and one of the two consuls, a certain Scipio, along with Camillus, restored Roman confidence at the time of the sack of Rome. So for several hundred years, the Scipios had been a distinguished family, almost a legendary family. And in fact, Scipio's father and uncle held generalships in the Roman army. His father was a consul, and they were, in fact, at the time of the beginning of the Second Punic War, entrusted with the command of Roman legions to go to Spain. And after some time there, with moderate success, were finally overcome, their troops killed, the generals killed. And at a very young age, Scipio Africanus found himself in a position to cross over maybe 20 years of patient political growth and find himself as a successor to his murdered father and uncle at a very, very tender age. Now, Scipio, in later Roman annals, became more and more mysterious. And as time went on, he loomed larger and larger on the Roman horizon as some kind of a prophetic, mystical, religious figure. He was, in fact, in the next generation from him, described by the great Greek historian Polybius as the most significant man to have lived upon the earth up until that time. And the legends began to proliferate, and in a Hellenistic fashion, which was quite ordinary in Alexandria. For instance, he was said to have had a divine birth, that in fact, the god Jupiter himself had come in the form of a large serpent and had helped sire Scipio Africanus. And as a proof of this, Scipio, even as a teenager, would habitually get up before dawn and go to the temple, the great temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, that in fact was observed many times going up there, and the temple dogs, who were usually kept there at night to keep away intruders, very vicious animals, would not even bark at Scipio. And he would go up and commune in the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus habitually. And when any great decision was to be taken, he would be seen there contemplating for many, many, many hours alone. He was born about 236 BC, and at a very tender age, it's somewhat up in the air whether he was 17 or whether he was 21, but at a very tender age, was elected as an aedile, a curule aedile, and the aedileship was a fairly high up political elected post, and they were in charge of the games, hosting the games, keeping the seasonal festivals and so forth in Rome under control. When news came that the Carthaginian armies in Spain had managed to slip past the Roman legions and were heading with a large body of troops, some 35,000 infantry, some 10,000 cavalry, hundreds of war elephants, and one of the most triumphal generals in history at the command, Hannibal, the son of the great Carthaginian general of the First Punic War. The Roman people were suddenly seized by panic and fear. And when Hannibal crossed over the Alps and came down into the northern part of Italy in 218 BC, it began to look as if some threatening thunderstorm was about to break. And in fact, the Barca name, Hannibal's family name was Barca, and in Phoenician language, it meant thunderbolt. And it's interesting to note that the Scipio family name also refers back to a lightning bolt type of phenomenon. So that really, in the names themselves, there were two lightning bolts struck on the anvil of circumstance in the Second Punic War. Hannibal was opposed by picked legions. Some 4 or 5 legions were kept in Italy at all times. There were 11 legions in the entire Roman Republic at the time of the outbreak of the Second Punic War, half of them in central Italy. Hannibal won several important small battles and skirmishes, and the Roman people were told lies that it was due to mitigating circumstances, and that at the next engagement, Hannibal would be, in fact, stopped. And they sent a very capable general, Flamininus, not to be confused with Flamininus, who was a protege of Scipio some 20 years later. But Flamininus, with 2 Roman legions, which would have been a standard field army, legions about 10 to 12,000 infantry and about 900 cavalry or so forth. So with about 25,000 men, went into the northern part of Umbria. Rome is down here in Latinium. The next province here is Umbria, and up here is Tuscany. And up here is Lake Trasimene. Hannibal was one of the most extraordinary characters in history, often sized up as the greatest general of all time, except for the man who beat him, which was Scipio. Hannibal had spent a profitable year as a commander, gaining booty and beginning to work out a plan of attack. He had a fierce hatred for the Roman people. He had felt that the First Punic War was an insult to the Barca clan, that his father had been wronged, and the one thing that he had in his mind was to shred the Roman Republic. And his plan, in large structure, was not to attack Rome itself, although at one point in his ravaging of Italy, he camped outside the city walls of Rome to let them see what a gorgeous figure he was. He was extraordinarily impressive as a human being, he had gotten an eye infection crossing the Alps, and one of his eyes was blinded. So he wore a patch. And he was quite a large individual. And out of the first generation of war elephants who had crossed the Alps, just one had survived, and that was Hannibal's personal elephant. So you can imagine this eye-patched man of great glorious physique astride of his elephant and his unconquered troops. And during the 15 years that he stayed in Italy, he was never beaten. So that we find at the long end of the Second Punic War, when Hannibal and Scipio Africanus met each other, they were undefeated. Neither had been beaten in battle up to the final battle of the Second Punic War. But Hannibal, at the time, about 217 BC, a year after he came into Italy, began flaunting himself between two Roman armies. A man named Servilius was in this area of Italy, and Flaminius in this area. And Hannibal put his army in between the two, hoping to draw Flaminius out into a fight, and even pulled in his flanking motions on his army and made one long column as if to naively parade himself as not knowing what he was doing or intentionally taunting Flaminius. But finally, after Flaminius and Servilius had their scouts confirm their positions, Flaminius began to chase Hannibal. And Hannibal, who was a first-rate military mind, and you have to realize that we're talking about proportions here, he was in a class almost by himself. His sense of military strategy was so far beyond what other normal generals in the field were that he was to them as those generals would have been to someone like myself. Absolute genius. We went along the shores, the north shore of Lake Trasimeno, and there was a spot of about 5 miles where the lake shore receded back maybe a half a mile or so, and then the mountains came down almost to the lake. And Hannibal, as soon as he got his army into this position, rushed them into the hills and waited there. And when Flaminius and his Roman column thinned down with his 2 legions and went in between the lake and the hills, Hannibal had his war elephants seal off the valley, and they fell upon the Roman troops and cut them to pieces. The news of the destruction of this Roman land army sent a shock of fear through the Roman people. And in particular, a lot of the allies of Rome, which had been hard won by patient battling and negotiation over the centuries, began to show the first quivers of disintegration, which is exactly the policy that Hannibal had in mind. In fact, when Servilius heard of the battle, he sent 4,000 cavalry on ahead, and Hannibal, of course, was all prepared for this, and they swooped down and destroyed the cavalry from Servilius' army. So that with this great tragedy, the Romans decided that they would have to put a quick end to the career of Hannibal. And so they taxed all of their allies and themselves to the utmost in terms of men and money. And they fielded 8 legions of soldiers, some 90,000 fighting men, and began to pursue Hannibal with this enormous army. And finally, down in the southern area of Italy, not far from the Adriatic coast, at a place called Cannae, Hannibal met this enormous army of Romans. He was outnumbered by quite a bit. But Hannibal arranged his troops in a crescent. And as the tremendous population of Romans came in against his center line of South Iberian fighters with his Numidian cavalry on one side and his Carthaginians on another side and backed up. This line slowly gave way until it became a concave rather than a convex motion. And the Roman army, with its enormous population and push, realized that they were now outflanked by their own forward motion. And Hannibal sent his force round both sides and trapped this enormous body of Roman legionnaires. And the statistics for the Battle of Cannae are often disputed. I've consulted Livy and Polybius in classical matters, and Toynbee and others in contemporary. And the best estimate is that the Romans lost about 55,000 killed that day, and another 10 to 15,000 captured. And the news of Cannae, following the news of Lake Trasimene the year before, suddenly sent a horrific image through the Roman people. And in fact, very, very quickly, small communities in Italy began to lay down their arms and open their doors to Hannibal and the Carthaginians. And in fact, that kind of a capitulation carried even to the great second most powerful city in Italy, aside from Rome, was Capua. Capua down by Naples at that time in Campania. And Capua was the great industrial center for the Roman Republic. And in a celebrated surrender, it welcomed Hannibal and the Carthaginians. So that the Roman people, as a people, felt that they were being terrorized by a devil, by a demon. And for many of the Roman people, this was a just desert. For the Romans had strayed themselves from their old agrarian traditions and had begun to imbibe these decadent Greek, or at least Hellenistic, modes of life, and that they were now being punished by the gods for their infidelity to their own traditions and background. Now, I have to backtrack just a little bit and bring in, I think, just one observation here, one thread of observation, the cult of Dionysius, just as an example. There were many examples that I could pick out, and I'll take this one. The cult of Dionysius, of course, had been a major feature of Greece as far back as Solon, certainly by Pericles' day. The cult of Dionysius was firmly entrenched. In fact, the great tragedies were acted at their festivals in the theater of Dionysius in Athens. But the cult of Dionysius, by the 2nd century BC, had undergone, as all Greek religious ceremonies had undergone, this wave of Hellenistic synthesis, so that the major figure in the cult of Dionysius ceremonies from time to time would be a very large phallic emblem rising among a spilled cornucopia of produce, not so much to emphasize fertility, but to emphasize immortality. But this kind of imagery to the Roman farmer was a sacrilege. And so the spread of the Dionysiac mystery religion rites, with all of the other attendant images and symbols and rituals which it would have brought in its train, became a tremendous offense to the Roman people. And exactly at the time and in the generation that this tremendous horror of Hannibal in their own country, ravaging the people and overcoming fabulous Roman numbers, by the will of the gods, apparently. It was in this situation, after Cannae, and in the tremendous feeling of unholy terror, that Scipio Africanus really came on the scene and delivered a tremendous speech in the Roman Senate. He had been there at Cannae. He was involved only in one battle before, because he was a youngster, really, at the Battle of Ticinus, when his father's life was in danger. He had rode out ahead of the line of the fighting troops, and he had become surrounded by Carthaginians. Scipio, as a young man, probably 17 years old, no more, had ridden out alone with his sword drawn and had actually inspired many of the Romans to follow him by his example, and they had saved his father's life. So he had been somewhat distinguished. But added to this mysterious quirk of his of being in the public eye as not only a refined, exquisite patrician with an excellent personality and refined manners, he also had this capacity for this mysteriousness, this darling of the gods image. And then added to that the third element of incredible personal bravery, of military acumen. Scipio, as a young man, became an object of attention. And in the next 6 or 7 or 8 years, when the fortunes of Rome seemed to be progressively undone and the city of Rome crushed more and more psychologically, the only highlights seemed to be the fact that there were some battles being won in Spain or in Sicily, other places than Italy. And finally, news came of the death of the 2 Scipios in Spain and their complete loss there. And so young Scipio Africanus presented himself before the Senate of Rome, a body of about 300 senior members of the community, and claimed a right as a private man to be appointed as a consul and to be sent to Spain to avenge the family disgrace. And in an act which at the time was unique in Roman history. And it was the first time that it had happened, though it would happen in later history, another century or so later, when Sulla also was given the privatus consulship. Scipio Africanus was appointed without having gone through any of the intermediate phases as a consul in charge of a couple of Roman legions, and was sent off to Spain. And at that time, most of Spain, south of the Ebro River, there's a map of Spain, and the Ebro is in northern Spain, almost up at the Pyrenees, only maybe 75 miles or so from the Pyrenees. Everything south of there was in Carthaginian hands, except for a little city called Segundum. The capital of the Carthaginian Spain was New Carthage, Cartagena, which was secure like old Carthage had been, because it was located on a peninsula, so that it was accessible by land only on one side. Carthage the same way. So New Carthage, very, very secure place. Scipio landed up at Emporium and made his way down to what today is Tarragona, at that time named Tarraco. And when he arrived, he gathered together his troops and delivered a speech which is reconstructed in imagination, of course, by the great Roman historian Livy. And I think we should hear this, because Livy did a lot of research, great artistic talent, cited often as a greater artist than a historian. But I think this first speech of Scipio's, just a paragraph out of it, gives you tone of what Romans contemporary with Augustus would have thought proper for Scipio Africanus to have said about 150 years before. Never has there been a new commander except myself who could with justice and propriety give thanks to his soldiers before he employed them. Fortune laid me under obligations to you ere I saw your camp or knew my province. First, because you showed such dutiful respect to my father and uncle during their lives and since their deaths. And next, because when the possession of the province had been lost by a dreadful calamity, you recovered it by your bravery and have preserved it entire for the Roman people and for me who succeed the command. But as, through the bounty of the gods, the design of our present proceedings is not to maintain our own footing in Spain, but to deprive the Carthaginians of all footing in it, not to stand on the bank of the Ebro and hinder the enemy from passing it, but to pass over ourselves and carry the war to the other side. I fear lest to some of you the undertaking may seem too great and too bold, considering the remembrance of our late misfortunes and my early time of life. There is no person living from whose memory the defeats in Spain can less be obliterated than from mine. For there my father and uncle lost their lives within the space of 30 days, and so that funerals in our family followed one another in quick succession. But while the disaster which bereft our house of parents and left me almost the only surviving male member of it depresses me and my mind with grief, still the fortunes of our nation and its courageous spirit forbid me to despair of this event. It is the lot assigned to us by some kind of fatality that in all important wars we should pass through defeat to victory. And so Scipio was setting the tone for an act that had never been considered in Roman history before them. They had always kept themselves to Italy. And even in the First Punic War, when they found themselves having Sicily and Sardinia and Corsica, they were just new words. They were not really possessions that had been assimilated. When Scipio arrived in Spain, about 210 BC, right in the middle of the Second Punic War, he addressed his legions forthrightly and declaimed to them that his purpose was to secure for the Roman people the entire country of Spain, this enormous province, almost the size of Italy itself. It had taken 500 years to secure most of Italy. And Scipio was now telling his men that with their backs against the wall, with their population terrorized by this demon, they not only would meet the challenge, but they would step across the Ebro and begin the conquest of this enormous province. But actually, Scipio had an even grander vision in mind. He had in his spirit the vision that Rome had come of age in himself, and says he was capable of envisioning a vast empire uniting man together in this large universal conception which Alexander had had before him, the idea of an ecumenic, a one world. And Scipio encouraged small legends that he was in fact a reincarnation of Alexander the Great and had come back after this 100 years' time, almost 100 years between them, and was going to reinstate the ecumeny, not with a Greek civilization exclusively, but with the Greek mind put on a Roman body, which would produce a superior man, one capable of setting up a world state. That the Greeks had had the mind for it, but hadn't had the character the tough body of population to carry it out. The Greeks could never work together, whereas the Romans, if they did anything well, fit brick by brick into monolithic structures that are still standing. And so Scipio's vision was that the time had come to reinstate the ecumenic, the one world vision, with a Greek mind and a Roman body. And he, in fact, from the very first step onto Spanish soil, when he had for the very first time command of a Roman army, foresaw that he was going to add not just Spain, but Africa and all of the Asian part of the Mediterranean to the Roman people, and that the Republic would in fact transform itself into this world ecumenic. I have in one of my volumes, I think it's in here, I think this is one of these volumes of Toynbee's. I have a map of the Greek ecumenic as Alexandria had envisioned it. And it spread literally across the known world at the time. And it is due to Scipio's fantastic rapport with his troops that he was able to get them to agree with him that they would pursue this event. It's probably in the back there in that volume. Pursuant to this vision of his, he also cautioned his troops that this was not merely the dream of an individual. He was not just there as a Scipio to avenge the death and the disgrace of his father and his uncle, nor simply as a Roman who was there to counterbalance the tremendous scathing that Hannibal was giving to the Roman people. But in fact, he had the best connections of all, that with the divine gods themselves, and that he had been given dreams since he was a youngster, which had always come true. And in fact, he then related the story, which Livy and Polybius both account, that the beginnings of his political career, when he was elected to the aedileship, that he had had a dream several nights before, which he told to his mother, that both he and his brother would be elected to these posts, even though his brother was some years older than he, and he was clearly underage, and got her to loan him a white toga, which was the token at that time that one was standing for election to this office, on sort of like a dream vision bargain with his mother, and in fact had worn this white toga out and came home having had the dream confirmed. So he told his troops there at Tarraco that no less a god than Neptune himself, Poseidon, was behind this push, and that in fact he had in mind for his very first engagement the siege of New Carthage, some hundreds of miles down the coast in Carthaginian territory. Well, the troops were aghast. What can you say? He's either mad or he's possessed by the gods, and we might as well go. So preparing his troops, he took several months to make sure that they were drilled properly. In fact, Scipio, all of his life, attended to the small matters. He would go around to where the blacksmiths were working, making sure that they were making the weapons right. He would go around to the food stuff, supplies, the commissaries and so forth, and make sure that it was nutritional food. In all these millions of little ways, he was constantly checking, like a good father would check the household and make sure that all the basic parts were working. And then he would drill his troops day in and day out in complicated group maneuvers until finally the blocky Roman army, which had served very well in these pedestrian wars of Italy, but which was being cut to pieces by generals like Hannibal, who were thinking in terms of higher structural terms. Scipio began to produce a sense of mobility within the Roman lines so that groups within the lines would move as bodies, and in fact, the whole lines. They usually had a 3-line army. And the hastati was the first line, and the princeps the second line, and the triarii the third line. And usually the first line would go in, and when enough were killed, the second line would replace them, and so on. The Scipio was to change all that. But he mustered his legions, and in a bold move, struck south through Carthaginian territory. And at this time, the Carthaginians had 3 separate armies in Spain. But Scipio had chosen a time when the nearest one was about 10 days away from New Carthage, Novo Cartagena. And in a rapid move for which he was forever famous, and which he was able to repeat several times in his career, he force-marched his men down the coast of Spain, keeping his fleet of transports and trimarines and quinquemarines along the coast, just in case. They made it to New Carthage, which was this tremendous fortified citadel, and camping on a place called the Hill of Mercury. The Hill of Mercury, this hermetic place by which Scipio, as the darling of the gods, could view his first great triumph. He arranged his ships around on the seacoast of New Carthage, and then immediately launched an attack against the walls with men with enormous ladders. And in order to encourage the men, Scipio himself went onto the field and into this tremendous rain of implements that the Carthaginians were throwing at the Romans. And he took with him 3 young men with shields to protect him. All of the besiegers realized that their commander was right there in the midst of it, and so did their darndest to get up these ladders and scale the walls. And the ships began to unload men and ladders on the seaside. And as this tremendous fray engendered, and the din of battle went up, Scipio then left the battle scene, went back beyond the Hill of Mercury, and with 500 picked men, swept around this enormous lagoon. New Carthage is here on this peninsula. Here is the Mediterranean Sea, and there was a lagoon here, an enormous lagoon. And when they reached the other side of this lagoon, a tremendous wind came up. And with the ebb of the natural tide going out, this tremendous north wind emptied the lagoon so that there were only about 5 or 6 inches of water. And with Scipio personally there, these 500 men rushed across this mile or 2 of the lagoon. And of course, this section of the walls of New Carthage were completely undefended. Nobody had ever suspected this. And Scipio had told his men that Neptune would be there helping them. They scaled the walls and dropped in, and they had the gates open before the Carthaginians, who were absolutely incredulous at this event, could believe that here the Roman general was in their city with an enormous body of men. So New Carthage fell that day, and Scipio Africanus sent a shockwave through the Carthaginian Empire. Now, Scipio had one of these incredible personalities. He was a vivacious kind of an individual. And all through the campaigns, the 10 years that he was a consul, both in Spain and in Africa, he loved to meet personally with those individuals with whom he was fighting, to size them up in a way, but also, I think, in a way to put the whammy on them, because he had this incredible facility at smoothing a situation out. And even though he would be talking to his worst enemy, somebody that he'd spent all of his life hoping to fight he had this tremendous affability. And it proved successful because after the siege of New Carthage, he began making sachets through the Spanish countryside, talking to all these chieftains, and they began to realize that this was indeed some God-sent individual. In their eyes, they were perfectly willing to believe that he was Alexander the Great. As far as they knew, New Carthage should have been unattainable. And the fact that he had done it in the first year that he was in Spain, his very first major battle, seemed to them proof enough. You have to realize that New Carthage was the center plug for the whole Spanish holdings of the Carthaginian people. When he got New Carthage, he got all of the military equipment that was held in reserve for the Carthaginian three armies in Spain. He got all the silver mines. When Scipio finally, several years later, went back to Rome, he took with him some 15,000 pounds of silver from the mines of New Carthage. So in one great move, he had simply denuded Carthage of money, equipment, and this popularity with the superstitious Iberians, the Celt-Iberians. So the Carthaginian leaders, there were two Hasdrubals. One was Hasdrubal, son of Gisco, who was way over towards Gades or Cadiz on the southern Atlantic coast of Spain. Mago, who was a brother of Hannibal, was up here in this area, and another Hasdrubal, Barca, was the nearest. Decided to challenge Scipio at a battle site known as Baecula. And it was unfortunate for him because Scipio had planned this confrontation for quite some time. He had been preparing the mobility of his troops for about a year and a half at this time. And in the Battle of Baecula was the first time that the Roman line, the three lines, was broken up. And it was in a valley situation where there were hills surrounding almost on three sides the fortifications of the Carthaginians, so that they felt totally secure. And they had only one front line to take care of, and that was where the Roman army would come. And they felt secure that their troops would be able to overcome. Scipio took the pick of his cavalry and infantry, detached them from the main forces, and had them run pell-mell in a sort of a columnar formation down some little side ravines and emerge about a mile or so down, back over the hills. And as they emerged from what looked like a pell-mell run, they immediately fell into the position as they were falling upon the Carthaginian flanks. And this tremendous, sudden impress on both sides of the Roman cavalry, and this is one of the first battles in which a Roman general used cavalry to great advantage. Before then, it had been sort of a decorative type of a piece of equipment. But under Scipio's training, you would have groups of 30 or 40 riders making a long serrated blade of slashing in, and there would be 30 or 40 more coming another way. In other words, the entire motion of these huge bodies of men would all be disciplined actions. And they would simply, like a sawtooth blade, cut the lines of opposing soldiers down. The Battle of Baecula, in which Scipio destroyed the Carthaginian army, infuriated the remaining Carthaginian soldiers, and they felt that at all costs, Scipio must be defeated on a battlefield. And so very quickly, the next season, the Romans were drawn into a battle at a place called Ilipa, which is near Seville in southern Spain, on the border between Andalusia and the Sierra Morena. Sierra Morena runs in between Andalusia, northern Andalusia, and La Mancha, which is on the other side of the Sierra Morena. At this battle, Scipio, who all the time was refining his strategies and his capacities, decided that he would introduce into his flanking motion a whirlwind type motion to his cavalry, where he would send out a double column, and they would split into an L shape, and the bottom of the L's would come out one way and the top would go around another, so that you had this kind of an odd whirlwind shape. So at the Battle of Ilipa, when the Carthaginians were expecting a flanking attack, they couldn't make heads or tails out of the movements of the Roman flanking attack. It looked like some were retreating and some were charging, and to them it was absolute chaos until they realized that this incredible buzzsaw effect was chewing them up. And again, the Carthaginians were defeated soundly by Scipio. Incredible battle tactics. And with the defeat of the Carthaginians at Ilipa, put together with New Carthage and Baecula, suddenly the field seemed wide open. And Scipio, in making a personal appeal to the leaders in Spain, began to convert tribe after tribe over to the Roman cause. And in fact, one of the great North African leaders, a man named Massinissa, decided that Scipio was in fact some divine personage and pledged himself and all of his Numidian cavalry to help Scipio, because Scipio confided to him that Spain was just the first step, that depriving the Carthaginian Empire of the wealth and manpower of Spain was phase one, and phase two was to go and deprive Carthage of its African populations and ground. And so Massinissa made a special compact with Scipio that he would in fact support him when he got to Africa the following year. And Scipio in fact was given a letter from Massinissa, and he went secretly across the Mediterranean to Spain to meet with another great African king named Syphax, who was also astounded at Scipio's personality and audacity to come individually with just a few companions across and see him in the midst of the Carthaginian Empire. And he also agreed to support him. So when Scipio went from Spain to Rome, he had already set in motion the pattern for his great African campaigns. Well, I think we better stop there and have a break. Are we to that time? We'll have our break and then we'll come back. You have to imagine that with the bickering and the Hellenistic monarchies, that the sudden rise of Rome, of the Roman Republic, was almost an inscrutable phenomenon to these old established areas like Egypt or Persia or Greece. The Carthaginians could be understood because they were Phoenicians. They were also ancient. The Carthaginians, as early as 490 BC, had sent an enormous fleet of vessels through past Gibraltar and down the coast of Africa as far south as the Cameroons in equatorial Africa. And not just one ship, but 3,000 men and women, and many, many ships. So the Phoenicians were very capable individuals and had a wide sea-flung empire. But the rise of Rome was a peculiarity. It was kind of like the early American Yankee Republic. It was just really one farm added to another, until after many hundreds of years. They held quite a chunk of territory, and then all of a sudden, in one generation with the First Punic War, they had hegemony in 3 islands around Italy. And then suddenly in the Second Punic War, in the next generation, they had all of Spain, all of Italy and Sicily and Sardinia and Corsica, and were working on Africa and had their eyes already set on Asia. So that in 2 quick successive generations, they moved from farmers to world empire. And even though it was still the Roman Republic, it would be so for just another 100 years, 150 years at the most. But already the idea of Rome was taking the ecumene of Alexander for its model. In 266 BC, there are many different large groups bicolored, you can see. And by the time that Scipio finished, there was really almost no competitor to Rome whatsoever. It was just a question then of holding together what they had, fortifying it, integrating it. And the key to it all was Africa, not Spain. Although Spain was enormous, the key to it was Africa. And in fact, his cognomen was Africanus, in honor of that achievement. Before he went to Africa, and when he had returned to Rome, he was refused a formal triumph. Parading around the Palatine Hill and going up to the sacred temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, which was like the favorite roosting place for the spirit of Scipio. He was refused that because he was still a privatus. He was a private citizen. He was there under a quirk of Roman law, a quirk in Roman law. He was still only about 30 years of age. He wasn't even old enough to hold the basic quaestor position. He already had conquered all of Spain, defeated 4 Carthaginian generals of very great repute. And when he came back to Rome and deposited this enormous mountain of silver and booty and so forth, it was an act to counterbalance the image that had been unloaded before the Carthaginian Senate after the Battle of Cannae, when so many tens of thousands of Romans had been killed. The Carthaginian soldiers went around and cut the rings off the dead Romans and sent these bales of rings, and they were dumped out on the floor of the Carthaginian Senate to show the mound of their triumph over the Roman people. And so Scipio had brought back with him a mountain of Carthaginian silver. And because Scipio was always a lenient individual, rarely, if ever, when he won a battle or captured a town, did he ever massacre or prosecute. His was the old Roman way of bringing into the larger family fold those who had lost. He would say, "You have lost. We have beaten you because of not just superior arms, but because of superior vision and capability. And if you will join us, that vision and capability will work for you too. And you may participate in the privileges of the future glory of Rome, which we'd better do anyway because it's inevitable. And here I am as a typical Roman to tell you this. And if you think that I'm impressive, wait until you see the generations coming down the line." He would talk like that. And of course, it was beginning to look more and more like maybe this wasn't a tall tale. He was allowed to sponsor a series of games. Remember, he had held the curule aedileship, and so he was master of the games as a young man. So for 3 days, he sponsored games, much like Olympic Games in Rome. And then had himself unanimously elected consul again and given as his domain the province of Africa, which had not yet been established. And as part of Africa, he would have Sicily under his control. And there were 2 consuls that year, and the other consul, who was Pontificus Maximus, which meant that he was also the head of a religious function in the Roman state, and therefore must stay in Italy, especially stay in Rome, was his old childhood buddy Crassus, a man named Crassus, very excellent man, who made sure that Scipio would have the political backing, and that persons like the conservative element that were trying to discredit Scipio because he was getting literally too big for Roman votes. And of course, for all they knew, if he was a reincarnation of Alexander the Great, what was there to stop him? Would he pay attention to the strictures of the Senate? He had the fanatical devotion of the Roman armies. Almost anyone who had served under him would go anywhere he would ask. On his way to Africa, he stopped in Sicily and took a vacation because Sicily was a cultivated Greek colony for many hundreds of years, especially in the city of Syracuse, where Hiero had been king for about 50 years. It had unparalleled prosperity and was like a Greek gem of the city, much like Alexandria, smaller version, of course. And Scipio put on Greek clothes and began going to the theater and taking his men around and enjoying the Greek culture of Sicily. And of course, people came back to the Roman Senate saying that this is not one of ours, he's one of theirs. Look at it. And one of the first people to begin to accuse him was Cato, young Cato, seeing a way to making his political ambitions come true. So he had publicized the fact that he would go and visit the old family cottage while somebody like Scipio was watching Greek plays in Syracuse. And so laid the seeds for a future confrontation. While Scipio was in Sicily, he noted that there was a Carthaginian colony still left at a little city named Locri. And so, in just a little dab at the Carthaginians, he took some troops, and with his great strategic mind, taking Locri was no problem whatsoever. But he was in a hurry to get to Africa, and he appointed a very bad individual as the overseer of Locri, a man named Polymnus. And Polymnus was a lech and a thief and a terrible sort of an individual, and very, very quickly, delegates from Locri were appearing at Rome, asking the Senate to send a commission, and 10 senators were sent to Locri, and of course they clapped Polymnus in irons, and the enemies of Scipio at Rome were pointing fingers, saying, look at the kind of men that he's associating with and putting in charge. But fortunately, Scipio was still above this sort of incrimination, and yet it was a quaver in the air, and left a residue of bitterness among the old agrarian republicans that maybe this Hellenistic infection which the Roman people were suffering had better be cured by discrediting the head, its chief representative, in the person of Scipio Africanus. So these kinds of undercurrents were at play. But meanwhile, Scipio arrived in Africa, and When he arrived, he began to lay siege to Utica, which is one of the large Carthaginian towns, somewhat north of Carthage. And in his haste to make an impression upon the Carthaginians, they had, of course, heard of him for many years, 4 or 5 years, as the undefeated Roman genius, mystical religious figure, fabulous personality, and they wanted to crimp him right away. And so they sent a Carthaginian general named Cannae out with a very large troop of men, hoping to catch Scipio unprepared. But Scipio had already made plans years before and had sent envoys ahead. And one of the Carthaginian allies, named Massinissa, had prepared himself to revolt on the snap of Scipio's fingers. And very soon after Scipio landed, he keyed Massinissa into a revolt, and Massinissa gathered together a large Numidian cavalry, and in a battle that's known as the Tower of Agapeles had been a Greek who had invaded the Carthaginian Empire about 150 years before. In front of Utica were several mounds, hills, and Massinissa came with his cavalry and waited in the pass there. And Scipio began retreating, and Cannae began following him, and suddenly Massinissa fell upon his flank with a large Numidian cavalry, and quickly Scipio turned his men and pressed forward, and with the mobility of the Scipionic line, Cannae was beat in a record time. The battle barely lasted an hour. And news of this went back to Carthage, and the Carthaginians began to have this enormous peace faction suddenly surfacing in the city, that maybe they had better deal with this individual. Because you see, Scipio was doing to them what Hannibal had done to the Italian people. All this while, Hannibal had marched up and down Italy, finally settling really in the southern portion of Italy. In fact, many of the Roman historians say that they were so successful that the troops were becoming degenerate from having grapes fed to them by captive Romans. So many captive Romans and so many grapes that they simply were getting too full to go out and fight. They'd become too successful. Scipio, on the other hand, was one of these real thunderbolt type personalities who would see to the core of the situation and go immediately there and pay no attention whatsoever to all the onion layers of complications surrounding it. And once to the core, would quickly engender in his mind a plan of action for the attainment of that core, and then persevere with it. So that after the Battle of Agapeles, the Carthaginians, sensing that Scipio was probably going to be on the immediate move, sent 2 enormous armies in to bottle him up in between the fortified city of Utica along this peninsula. And so they set 2 huge armies here. So that he was between the 2 armies and the fortress of Utica, and was unable to be supplied by his ships and unable to maneuver. And so he spent the whole winter in that situation. The Carthaginians more and more thinking that they had the genie in the bottle, and they had him trapped. And Scipio's men, of course, trusting to the fact that since they were with the darling of the gods, he would find some way, which he did. Typical Scipio visionary moves. He noticed that the fortifications of the army camps of the Carthaginians, because they had been set up quite rapidly, were made out of log posts with waddling constrictions weaved in between them. And so Scipio had informed his men that they were going to try to go on the move and break out the next morning. And this word was circulated around camp. And meanwhile, he made sure that all of his men were fed in the middle of the night. And then hours before dawn, sent out a group of men and set fire to barricades of the Carthaginians, who were absolutely astounded and thought that this was an accidental fire that had broken out. So they were trying to put the fire out. Meantime, the Romans went around the camp and laid siege to it. And Scipio's lieutenant, Laelius, came out and quickly ran around this side because they had set fire to this barricade. And so these men were going to help these men put out a fire. And suddenly they realized that Scipio's troops were everywhere with their swords out. And Scipio, by this time, had replaced the old Roman stabbing sword with the Celtiberian cutting sword. And they destroyed both Carthaginian armies. Well, when dawn came, of course, the people of Carthage were absolutely terrified that maybe they did have a god to contend with, because Scipio was pulling rabbits out of the hat faster than they could dream up situations to put him in. And of course, Scipio's men by this time were fanatically behind him. Whatever he was planning, they were ready to go. So he disciplined his men and began to seek a way in which to meet on a field of battle in sort of a classic formal way, a Carthaginian army, to show them that it wasn't just tricks and games that he was beating them with, but absolute superiority in military conception. This is a biography of Scipio, which is not very good, but I'll read you a short section here. This is by a man named Scullard. He soon conceived a plan as daring and unexpected as the one after his first winter in Spain, when he struck at New Carthage. Learning that the Carthaginian camps were made of branches and reeds without any earth, he planned to set them on fire. Meanwhile, he deliberately held out hopes of reaching an agreement with Syphax to enable frequent emissaries to be sent with officers and spies disguised as slaves to explore the approaches and entrances and positions of the two hostile camps. So all this time, he was also trying to win over Carthage's allies by promising them the same kind of conditions that he had promised Massinissa. And in fact, in a very unusual ceremony, he presented Massinissa with an ivory staff, which was the family religious emblem of the Scipio. Scipio means the staff. And it was a carved ivory staff. And what he meant by it was that Massinissa was incorporated into his family tradition in a very secret kind of religious fraternity, sort of a way. And Massinissa, in his regard, understood that Scipio, with all of his charmed Jupiterian thunderbolt qualities and power, was inviting him into a share of immortality, really, with him. And with this ivory staff, decided that he was going to help in the battle, which was known as the Battle of the Great Plains, or in Italian it's called the Battle of Campi Magni, the Great Plains. And so Massinissa's Numidian cavalry trained with the Scipionic techniques of maneuver and formed one flank of Scipio's three lines, the Hastati, the Princeps, and the Treari. And Laelius, who was with Scipio all during his 10 years as a consul, was on the other flank. These setups found that the Carthaginian army, when it faced them on Campi Magni, had decided that they were going to try to push through Scipio's front line, and that this would be a way of finally beating him. But after a staff meeting, Scipio decided to divide his forces. This could be done in safety since Syphax had fled, it's another leader who decided to come over but had gone. The Carthaginian force was checked, and the Romans were masters of the interior. Scipio's tactics were of further development for those used in Spain at Ilipa. Previously, the princeps, the second line, had stood behind the hostati, either ready to come up into the first line to strengthen it in the actual attack or to fill any gaps in it. In the same way, the triarii were the reserve to the second line. Now the princeps and the triarii no longer directly supported the first line. The old triple line was still preserved, but each line formed a self-dependent unit. So the second line started to file off to the left, and the third line filed off to the right, until on this enormous plain, Scipio had achieved this enormous long line of fighting Roman troops. And then, of course, just wrapped them around like huge bear arms, the Carthaginian opponents. And they found themselves absolutely engulfed because the cavalry, which they were expecting to do a flanking motion, had been drawn off by the Carthaginian cavalry, and it was the incredible infantry that had done the flanking motion. The Battle of Campi Magni forced the Carthaginians to finally call Hannibal back from Italy, where he had been for 15 years, and he had been in Spain some 20 years before that, so that Hannibal had not been home for some 35 or 36 years. And he was called back, and of course Hannibal, with his verve and dash, his unbeaten record, landed with great confidence at Fort Hadramton, and began immediately moving inland with a very, very large army. Tremendous cavalry, tremendous units, and he had been gathering reports about Scipio's techniques and strategies. Scipio, in a dream, saw this one-eyed figure coming into a battle situation, and he also saw that his spirit brother Massinissa was the key to his victory. And so he sent word for Massinissa to join him again. He was over in this area. And Scipio began marching down to meet Hannibal at a place called Zama, near that. And Massinissa was coming in rather slow, so that Scipio had to move out this way. And when they met on the field, these two enormous armies camped within about 4 miles of each other. And the day before the battle commenced, Hannibal desired to meet Scipio face to face and see what kind of an individual he was, whether he was divine or not, and also to show himself off. And so, with just a couple of envoys, these two great undefeated military geniuses met in the valley in between the two camp tribes, almost like the situation in the Bhagavad Gita, and spent the entire day talking to each other with who knows what kind of interest. And at the end of the day, having agreed to kill each other in the morning, they rode back to their respective camps. And the next day, when the troops lined up and the classic battle formations were had, Hannibal's enormously sophisticated army had lined up so that there were the two front lines were very close to each other. And the third line back somewhat. And in front of the hostati line were 80 war elephants, one of the largest concentrations of war elephants ever used in ancient battle. And for Scipio's part, he had lined up his troops, surprisingly, in sort of a traditional way, except for the fact that he broke the three lines into segments. And instead of having the segment behind cover the interval, they were matched evenly. And he had his cavalry on the side, as did these. When the battle was joined, Hannibal's third line went a half step so that this gap widened. And as the front two lines went together, it formed like a solid punching mass, which Hannibal hoped with the disarray that the elephants would cause, that this mass group would literally push the Romans back, and that when the flanking cavalry came in to surround this group, Hannibal would use his third line of cavalry as an army and butcher the cavalry, and then push on to the line. But Scipio had seen this, and he understood. And as the war elephants came on, the front line began to clang their swords on their shields, and the elephants began to panic and run through these aisles, all the way through the whole army. So that the two lines of Hannibal's armed forces suddenly found themselves face to face with the Scipionic line, and a fierce battle began developing here. And Hannibal then decided that he would have to bleed off the Roman cavalry, so he sent his cavalry off on the flanks as if they were going way out around, and the Roman cavalry followed off the field. And Hannibal then thought that he would bring his third line up as a flank. But the Scipionic mobility of these individual units began operating in such a way that the whole line was in motion and began to disintegrate the battle lines that Hannibal set up. Well, very, very late in the day, the two armies paused for about a half an hour to regroup, and the battlefield was just littered with blood and guts, literally. And then Hannibal sent in his whole lines, thinking that without the cavalry, that his superior numbers would doom the Romans. And as they came in, Scipio made a kind of concavity, almost like a hand, to catch this tremendous push of the Carthaginians. And Massinissa and Lilius came back, having let the cavalry go, and on target came together in sort of like an implosion strategy. And Hannibal's troops were absolutely decimated. The entire Hannibalic army was literally torn up on the field of battle. And Hannibal fled back in disgrace to the port here, and then went to Carthage. At this moment, all of Africa was open to Scipio. He had not only beaten the Carthaginians, but he had beaten the terrific demonic image of Hannibal. He had taken the terrific on its own grounds, in terms of its own image base, and had moved in a mirror complement and had vanquished it by the same sort of strategy and movement for himself. And at this moment, Scipio realized that all of his allies, as they had done in Spain, now were trying to call him king. And again, as he had done in Spain several times, calling his men together, telling him that he was not a king, that he was in fact a private Roman citizen doing his duty for his country, and that peace would now be had with Carthage, that he would not besiege the city. He had nothing against the Carthaginians as a people. In fact, made sure that they were still viable, still held some trade ports, but that they no longer had a base from which to build an empire. And when he went back to Rome, this time he was given a triumph. And in the list of the Roman senators, his name was first the following year at Rome, which meant that he was the prince of the Senate, the princeps senatatis. And it was the tribute from the Senate of Rome to someone who had been ostensibly always a private individual. That is, he represented the people of Rome more than the Senate of Rome. Remember SPQR Senatus Publiusque Romanum, the Senate and the people of Rome. These two elements work together. And Scipio had been from the people's side, and now the Senate honored him and made him the Princeps Senatatus, the first man of the Senate. In this situation, Scipio found himself suddenly the focus of all of these domestic civil energies that had been in conflict for all of his generation, because he represented to many fundamental old Roman republicans the epitome of what was wrong with the new Rome, and yet to others he represented the epitome of what was right with the new Rome, so that there was no middle ground whatsoever. There were fanatics on both sides, praising him to the skies or condemning him to the dregs for the very same thing, that he was literally a Greek mind on a Roman body and had made of himself a curiosity. I think I'll read this quotation from Toynbee. This is from Polybius. Polybius wrote his history about a generation later, and he interviewed all the surviving people of the Second Punic War, including Scipio's great lieutenant, Lilius, and got all these stories. And this is what he wrote. He wrote in Greek. Now that my narrative has brought me to the point at which I have to record Publius Cornelius Scipio's achievements in Spain, and in fact to give a general account of the whole of his career, it seems to me to be essential that I should provide my readers with some introductory instruction about Scipio's policy and character. After all, he is perhaps the most celebrated figure in history up to date. So everyone is eager to know what he was really like and what were the character and the way of life that enabled him to accomplish so many great achievements. At the same time, everyone is condemned to ignorance and misapprehension by the unfortunate fact that the information about him has been so remote from the truth. The soundness of this contention of mine will be revealed by the course of my narrative to all readers who are capable of appreciating Scipio's finest and most daring deeds. Now, Polybius had been given an insight by an adopted descendant of Scipio Africanus. And Polybius had been a Greek, a member of the Achaean League, who had been captured. He spent about 16 years in Rome. And while he was there, he became sort of adopted into the inner circle of the patrician Scipios and was given all the family records to write this history of the Second Punic War and the right to interview all people. And he was taken to the various sites. And he wrote his history of the Second Punic War at about the time that the Third and final Punic War was taking place and coming to a close. And a lot of Polybius's history is colored by two important facts. One, he believed that the central question of human history was, is there such a thing as fortune? The Greek word is psyche. Is there such a thing as fortune? Do the gods or do divine levels play an active role in human life? And if so, then Scipio was, in fact, everything that legend claimed for him to be. That there was no way for an individual to have achieved what he had done. And incidentally, he not only extended Rome to all of Spain and Africa, but later on, his protégés counseling with him also made Asia a province for Rome. And in fact, Scipio was always in personal contact with the leaders of the Seleucid Empire and the Macedonian people, the people's leader, Philip, and they respected Scipio as a divine personage. Their correspondence, which survives in fragments, shows this. But for Polybius, the next generation down the line, looking back at Scipio, the question was, had fortune, had the gods actually come into play? And if so, what was the purpose of history? What was the purpose of man written large? And was Scipio right in his sharing of the vision of Alexander the Great, that the world was to be a single world, an ecumene, that there was no longer to be a polis, a political scheme for mankind, but a cosmopolis, a cosmopolitan scheme for man, which made of the world one empire of humanity, and that there was such a thing as a universal man. So that this issue for Polybius was paramount. The second great point of Polybius was that he lived at the time in which the Third Punic War was brought to a close. And this time, the Roman character was permanently bent and misshapen in the sense that instead of just beating Carthage yet again, they laid siege to Carthage. And after great expense in manpower and time, not only captured Carthage, but stone by stone effaced it from the earth. They dug it up, all the foundation stones, poured salt on the land, and completely erased it from human history. And at the same time as this was happening in 146 BC, they were also moving into Greece in the same way. In Polybius's home ground in the Achaean League, and several places in Greece were also treated the same way. That the Romans were no longer interested in just winning battles and adding allies to the structure of the Roman people, but they were interested in just obliterating any competition whatsoever if they got in their way. And that Carthage would be a sign to all people from then on throughout history that there was only one ecumene. There was only one world, and Rome was it. That Rome was no longer just a city in Italy, but had become a worldwide conception, other than which there were only barbarians. So that Polybius was writing in that following generation, he could see that the root person for the understanding of the true meaning of what was happening and what was to be was in the person of Scipio Africanus. And that the context for Scipio was the tremendous Hannibalic incursion for a whole generation in Italy, unchecked. And that somehow in the Second Punic War, in that confrontation between ultimate good and ultimate evil, in terms of Roman eyes, that some basic balance had been struck and that good had won because of a choosing of the Roman people for a historical task, which they could no longer refuse to accept, and anyone who would then refuse their acceptance and the conception of it were to be erased, much like a new pharaoh would erase from the obelisk the writing mention of successors who, ancestors who had proven undesirable. Only Rome extended it. Instead of erasing the hieroglyphic on an obelisk, they would erase an enormous populous city from the face of history. And so we find that with the Second Punic War, and all of its classic accounts came from the next generation later, that something had happened in the ancient world, that the vision of Alexander's ecumene, which had looked like it was transplanted to Alexandria, suddenly was snatched away by Rome and held up not so much as the wonderful golden banner or the ivory staff of Scipio, but as the bleeding corpse of Carthage in 146 BC. So we next time we'll move beyond this event, a generation or so, and see what is happening in the ancient world at that time. I hope you'll be able to be with us. Thank you.